I will try this again. More triangle congruence. Last week we talked about side, 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 and side, angle, side congruence. Today we're going to talk about angle, side, angle. Which is abbreviated ASA. And your postulate there on page 275 says that if two angles and the included side of one triangle are congruent to two angles and the included side of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. Angle, side, angle. If two angles and the included side of one triangle are congruent to two angles and the included side of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. And here's what a diagram of that would look like. Triangle ABC. And triangle DEF. You need an angle, included side, and an angle congruent to an angle, included side, and an angle. The congruent side must be the side that's touching both angles. The congruent side must be touching both angles. And in this case, your congruence statement would be, you can call the triangle on the left whatever you want to call it, so I'm going to call it ABC, is congruent to triangle. Now in the first description, the first vertex used was at the angle with one tick mark. So we have to start the second description at the angle with one tick mark, so it's going to start with E. And in the first description we went through the side that's congruent. So we're going to go through the side that's congruent in this second description, so it's got to go EDF. Alright, so your congruent statement would be that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle EDF by angle, side, angle. Alright, let me show you what a picture would look like when the triangles are not congruent by angle, side, angle. So if you had something here, XYZ, and MNO. And in the triangle on the left, you had an angle, a side, and an angle. And then in the triangle on the right, you had an angle, and a side. These two would not be congruent. Alright, these are not congruent because the sides in this case, the sides that are congruent are not between the congruent angles. Okay? Hopefully you see the difference between that picture and this picture right here. In order to use angle, side, angle, the sides that are congruent have to be touching the angles that are congruent. There's an example of where they are. Here's an example of where they're not. Alright, so those two triangles are not congruent by angle, side, angle. Page 276. Angle, angle, side. Its abbreviation is Aas Congruence. And this postulate states that if two angles and a non-included side of one triangle are congruent to two angles and a non-included side of another triangle, then the triangles are congruent. And a diagram of that would look like triangle XYZ and triangle MNO. Angle, angle, side. Angle, angle, side. So now we've got an angle, and a non-included side. In this postulate, the side that's congruent is not touching both of the angles. It's only touching one of the angles. So an angle, non-included side congruent to an angle, and a non-included side. Okay? A little different from the previous postulate. So then your congruence statement for these two triangles the triangle on the left, I'm going to call it Z, X, Y, is congruent to triangle. If we started with the Z in the left-hand triangle, that's the angle that's not congruent to anything right now. We're going to use the M in the triangle on the right. If we used X as the second vertex and it's got one arc mark, we're going to use N that only has one arc mark. And finally O. So the congruent statement would be that triangle ZXY is congruent to triangle MNO by, this is angle, angle, side. Any questions on either of those postulates? Angle, side, angle, and angle, angle, side. On page 278, if you're interested, there is a summary of the 4 postulates that we've covered with diagrams of each. If you want to get those in your notes, it might be very helpful because everything's condensed and not abbreviated, but the wording of the postulates is cut way down. It's not nearly as wordy as the postulates that you wrote in your notes. So that might be something you want to get into your notes before you get started on your assignment today. All right, so here's a little bit of practice for you. All right. Page 279. Sorry, it doesn't look like it starts on 279. It starts on 280. You got a big assignment today. You got problems 14, 15. (27 through 30). And then number 33.